Good morning. Hopefully you're having a great day and all is well with you and your loved ones. There's something that I noticed when I was doing research for my last video, and it set me thinking that perhaps the feminist waves are successions of failed socio-epistemic projects. Right. There's a certain aspect of the entire project that looks to be epistemic in nature. They're looking to gain knowledge of a particular thing, and it struck me to have certain odd features to it that I thought would be useful to examine. Right. When I was doing research for my last video and I was reading some of the material, it occurred to me that some of these writers, that if you read them with three questions in mind, you notice some odd patterns that are divided, that seem to overlap with certain periods, right? When you ask yourself, what is the analysis of the problem? What is the analysis of the cause of the problem? And what is the solution they propose to the problem? So it seems to me that the problem that the feminists were trying to solve is that to them, it seems that female accomplishment lags behind male accomplishments. And the first thing that made me start to wonder was, is that really the case? Right? But when you map it in that way, you start seeing common threads and you start seeing common ideas, which I thought are quite interesting. All right. So, like with the first wave, I think the problem statement is this, that, or rather the claim is this: if it wasn't for custom, government, and law, men and women would be the same, right? The tool they're using is liberalism, like with the seminal text, right? What the strategy I'm using is going through some quotes of the seminal texts and using them to be representative of all the others, because you find that common thread, right? So with the first wave, the tool we're using is liberalism, right? And it was presenting like the same type of propaganda that was used against kings and aristocracy. You find it's set against male and female relations, right? So I think that presented by the quote by Millie Wollstonecraft: Men endeavor to sink us still lower, merely to render us alluring objects for a moment. And women, intoxicated by the adoration which men under the influence of their senses pay them, do not seek to obtain a durable interest in their hearts, or to become the friends of the fellow creatures who find amusement in their society. Right. What is the solution that we propose? Of course, if custom law and government is the problem, what you need is control of that, right? As Mary Wollstonecraft to say that she's not looking for women to have power over men, but rather to have women to have power over themselves, right? And so says that what? It is time to effect a revolution in female manners, time to restore to them their lost dignity, and make them, as a part of the human species, labor by reforming themselves to reform the world. It is time to separate unchangeable morals from local manners, right? Women ought to have representatives instead of being arbitrarily governed without any direct share allowed them in the deliberations of government, right? And I think this is now what emerges in respect as suffrage, because that was the big activism phase, right? And that was what they looked to push through. Okay. Then when things don't, I think several years goes down the line and things don't pan out as they were expected, right? And so in the second wave, you find a different analysis of the problem, right? Remember, it's the same issue, right? To their minds, or to their conception, that to them there is a gap between male and female accomplishment, right? And now there is a switch of the tool that's being used. So shifting from using liberalism, right? The tool that's used now is critical theory, right? And under this view, social problems come from social structures, right? Critical theory being traced back to the Frankfurt School, which is drawing. What we can say it's drawing from sociology and literary criticism, right? Yeah. So how do they how do they validate the idea of the notion? If it wasn't for community and family, we'd be the same, right? So there's the idea of the distinction being made that one is not born and rather becomes a woman, right? So they're now framing it that yes, it's due to the social structure that this is happening, right? Simone de Beauvoir describes it as her wings are cut, then she's blamed for not knowing how to fly, and yeah, and even and you see how now this is being tied to it's tied to society, and furthermore it's connected to men, right? And so it is, and then with like what part of the propaganda, right, or the rhetorical attack, with statements such as a man attaches himself to a woman not to enjoy her, to enjoy himself, right? So okay, it's being there's this pushback against family and community and motherhood, right? Yeah, actually, famously, the second sex does place pregnancy as one of the issues that are keeping women from meeting this imagined standard, right? And in order to do that, you have to say that those people that are around you are in it for themselves. Therefore, you should be also in it for yourself, right? So when I was a child, when I was an adolescent, books saved me from despair. That convinced me that culture was the highest of values, right? So there's this social arrangement that humans have lived by for generations, right? And now it's being described as an obstacle to accomplishment, whatever that means, right? And then what is the solutions for them is to divorce themselves from community and to destroy family, right? And I think that's, well, reading radical feminists is quite the shocker, some of the ideas they would have, right? And for them, they choose to define this thing as freedom, right? And to them, freedom seems to take the form of women must be independent of family and motherhood, right? What is this point? Yeah. The point is not for women to simply take power out of men's hands, since that would change anything. That wouldn't change anything about the world. It's a question precisely of destroying that notion of power, right? And when you're pushing against community and family, how do people push back? How do people justify it? Isn't no wonder Simone de Beauvoir would say oppression tries to defend itself by its utility, right? And even go as far as saying, as long as the family and the myth of the family have not been destroyed, women will still be oppressed. So that is the problem they envisioned, and this is the solution they push forward. And it starts, and the process starts in their communities, right? And then we come now down all the way to roughly 30 years, right? To now what they call the third wave, right? And then now, see, they still have it seems that it is still notion, there's a notion still being passed forward that male and female accomplishment is unequal, or it differs in a way that is not acceptable, right? And in the third wave, it seems to me that they're communicating that if it wasn't for norms, we'd be the same. We being male and female, right? And the tool now they switch to is queer theory, right? And now they're targeting the normal we being the problem, right? So in queer theory, there'll be this notion that heterosexuality isn't normal, right? And you've noticed the arguments will take the form of XXX isn't normal or something isn't normal, right? And essentially, I think you can summarize it as norms aren't natural, right? And quoting from one of the writers who is associated with this wave, right? Naomi Wolf would say something like, a cultural fixation on female thinness is not an obsession about female beauty, but an obsession about female obedience, right? So you notice there's this now setting up norms as the obstacle, right? No matter what a woman's appearance may be, it will be used to undermine what she is saying and taken to individualize as her personal problem, observation she makes about the beauty myth in society. And so now you find this move, right? So that now, so at first it was customs, government, laws, that's the issue. When that is no longer an obstacle, community and family and motherhood is the issue, then that is apparently no longer an obstacle, and now it turns out that no, actually the issue is norms, right? Then the solution was what? There needs to be to raise consciousness and to make them so individualistic that they do not adhere to these norms. So the raising of consciousness phase is to make them think that, hey, you know, these norms, these expectations, these things that you want to fit in, these things are the problem. And you notice some of these things that each successive wave is complaining about are partly the outcrop of the changes that the previous waves have put forward, right? So when you complain, like, yes, okay, funny enough, that's one of the objections that put, that some of the complaints will be described as whining, right? They needed to raise consciousness because the goals of the other two waves have been implemented in some form within their societies, right, or in the West, and thereby people think it's okay, but then the gap is still there, the problem is still there, and now these thinkers of this wave, they are pointing out together that no, like we need to raise consciousness and awareness that, hey, you know, it wasn't those things that the previous people talked about, or even though they would say that the things they put forward were good, right? And now that would lead you to the solution would be individualistic, right? Forget the norms. Let's be shameless, be greedy, pursue pleasure, avoid pain. Wear and touch and eat and drink what we feel like. Tolerate other women's choices. Seek out the sex we want and fight fiercely against the sex we do not want. Choose our own causes. And once we break through and change the rules so our sense of our own beauty cannot be shaken, sing that beauty and dress it up and flaunt it and revel in it. And so you notice this, that move to objectivity didn't work, right? And the objectivity of reality and the issues is inadequate. And therefore we should subjectivize these values, right? Yeah, these axioms, these fundamental observations, and thereby by taking charge of that, somehow male and female accomplishment should become the same. Because when they're saying about, the typical phrasing of the issue being the quest is for equality, but then you look at the policies that are pushed forward and the activism, where the activism targets, the issue seems to be this strange perception that male accomplishment is ahead of female accomplishment, right? And so we come to the fourth wave, right, which is a modern one, right? And I think with this wave, the strategy now shifts, right? And they say that if it wasn't for men, we'd be the same, right? So they had, in all the waves, there's criticism of males, right? And then there's criticisms of social order, social arrangements, right? There's even a rejection of some objective facts, right? So under queer theory, there's that rejection of the essential nature of gender and sex, right? There is that rejection of community, right? So you could argue that human social structures emerge from a biological base and a biological instinct and impulse, right? But then all that is rejected, and it has this whole, and I guess the influence of Michel Foucault, right? So there's this framing, right, of all these things to be a product of consensus, right? They do not see it as a rational response, right? Like, because humans do have rational instincts, and they do have, you could talk about rational instincts, and you do have some moral instincts, right? And these things lead us to certain arrangements. And those are presented now as fictions, right? Useful fictions, right? And because things are unpleasant, they need to be changed. And so now this fourth wave, they are using mixed activism, right? And this is what they so finding what I found, like finding the solutions they propose, like what we are finding who are the seminal or the key authors and writers was quite hard. But these are some of the quotes I found that would be describing the fourth wave, right? And since it's we are contemporaneous with these thinkers, I think you'd recognize some of the statements here, right? Men explain things to me still, and no man has ever apologized for explaining wrongly things that I know and they don't. Well, that author was credited with the idea of mansplaining, or popularizing the idea of mansplaining. Intersectionality means being aware of and acting on the fact that different forms of prejudice are connected because they all stem from the same root of being other, different, somehow secondary to the normal, ideal status quo. You notice now that targeting of distinctions, right? That's how I'm framing it, like if it wasn't for men, it would be the same. But then this is a bit more essential, more fundamental. Without a male-female distinction, there is no sexual or gender difference. And if there is no sexual or gender difference, there is no accomplishment gap, right? Leaving women out of the story isn't a simple slip-up. It's a consequence of a world that tells us they just aren't quite as important, that their achievements do not really count. It means that even now, some of us do still need reminding that women are people too. So you notice the rhetorical moves, right? The rhetorical strategies, and it's a common thread you find all through, reframing things and making, word games, right? Take a normal word and use it in a different way than it's expected. So freedom is now used so freedom can be freedom from motherhood or family, right? Rights could be control, right? And then what's the solution, right? So solutions for them is rejecting distinctions, right? Women's liberation has often, to quote Rebecca Solnit, right? Women's liberation has often been portrayed as a movement intent on encroaching upon or taking power and privilege away from men, as though in some dismal zero-sum game, only one gender at a time could be free and powerful. So you notice that, so you notice this is, she's responding to a possible objection, or how the objections to the other issues from the other movements have been taken by people, right? And I'm trying to set up a certain disconnect, right, in this wave, right, where there is a distinction, but they want to erase the distinction, because erasing the distinction erases a problem, right? Then there's no good answer on how to be a woman. The art may instead lie in how we refuse the question, right? So the move here is that what? There is no womanhood, right? And you see how they build up from the successive ones, right? And it's becoming more expansive, and it's looking to control more and more and more, right? And even you can hear this, marriage equality is a threat to inequality. It's a book to everyone who values and benefits from equality. It's for all of us. And so you see this weird move of looking to erase distinctions, right? Denial of certain objective things, right? You'll find papers that attack things like objectivity in science as male, right? And there's so many different odd assertions and odd philosophical approaches and epistemic claims that you'd wonder to what end, right? And so in summary, all right, the steps was that, the problem is custom and government, so basically political legal arrangements. So when that seemed no longer to be the issue, the problem was the family. When that seemed to be the issue, the problem was the consciousness of the women. And when that ceased to be the issue, it was the distinction between male and female. and therefore the project now seems to be the erasure of male and female. And of course, this seems to be quite absurd, and that's why I think of them as successions of failed social projects. This one doesn't work and they move on to another one. And I think they fail as social projects, or even social epistemic projects, but the sheer fact that the problem that is identified actually isn't a problem and actually might not even exist. Is there really a gap between male and female accomplishment? I don't think that is the case. And that's why I think the various waves are demarcations of acknowledgement of the failures of the social project.